We have one more panel to go. We promise to make it worth your while. I just have a few things I have to say now because I don't want to keep you at the end. The first is I want to thank Maxine Jacobson for heading up this event and making sure it all happened, so join me in thanking her. The second is I want to thank all of our supporters who have gotten us this far, and many of whom are here in the audience, and thank you very much. It's very rare to have an event like this with these kind of people that is free and open to the public. So this is to thank you for making that happen. And the third is I'm not going to make any final comments. I'm going to let Phil Hirschkorn do that at the end, but there is a reception afterwards. And we hope you'll all join us for that. So let me introduce this panel. This panel, which is the wrap-up, is really more focused than the other panels to talk about what is ISIS, what's the difference between ISIS and al-Qaeda, what does this actually mean here and now, from people who have been studying this either practically, academically, or policy-wise for many years. Our moderator is Phil Hirschkorn, who knows about as much about terrorism, counterterrorism, and terrorism prosecutions in the United States as just about anyone, having been on that beat since before the Moussaoui trial, throughout the Moussaoui trial, and even now. He has written many things on the topic. He's worked for a number of news stations, and right now he's not only a fellow at the Center on National Security, but he is a producer at PBS NewsHour, and he is a producer for PBS Weekend Show. So without further ado, Phil.
Thank you, Karen. Do I need to push this to talk? Okay, it happens automatically. Cool. Very good. So thank you all for staying. We're going to try to keep this lively and keep it moving. And let me start by telling you, if you haven't already read the bios, who's who. On my left, we have Adam Shatz, who writes a lot about these issues: ISIS, terrorism, politics, culture, foreign affairs. Right now he's with the London Review of Books, and he's written a number of articles relevant to our discussion. To my left is Hina Shamsi, who's an attorney with the ACLU's National Security Project, which she oversees. She's involved with a number of cases that are in the news, including the CIA torture case in Washington State, including the NYPD surveillance of Muslims case, and others, which I'm sure we will talk about. Speaking of attorneys, this is Josh Dratel, who's also a fellow at the center, who has been doing defense work in terrorism trials, certainly as long as I've been covering them, since the late 90s. Josh has represented a number of what I will call, and maybe he'll object, real deal al-Qaeda defendants, not so much the wannabes, but the real guys who belong to the group, and have been involved in some of the plots over the years, providing them a vigorous defense in court, as they are entitled under the Constitution, even if they are foreign nationals, and usually they are, aren't they? We'll talk about some of those cases. And to my right, at the end, J.M. Berger, who is a scholar of all of this, used to be with Brookings. He's now with the George Washington University program on extremism, and he's written one of the few good books that are out there on ISIS with Jessica Stern, which is for sale in the lobby, and I read it in preparation for this. So everyone here has different experiences and a lot of thinking and writing about these topics. What I thought we would do is really focus on where are we now, 5 years after bin Laden is dead, 15 years almost after 9/11. Where is al-Qaeda and where did ISIS come from? I think we can talk about, I'd like us to talk about, and they all know this and now you're hearing it, the shifts, the differences in the two groups, whether that's the kinds of attacks that they've carried out or tried to carry out, their ideologies, how they operate. We'll go through a whole list of points. And certainly, perhaps most importantly for this audience, the shift in the American response, both here at home in terms of prosecutions and cases in court, issues like surveillance that affect all of us, but also abroad, which has been a big focus, obviously the last panel and other panels today, what we're doing to retaliate militarily or otherwise. So why don't we start with differences. And I wanted to ask about, first of all, leaders and ideology. And Jan, maybe you should kick things off here. We had bin Laden, now we have Zawahiri, we had Zarqawi, now we have al-Baghdadi. Not so much who are these guys, but what is it that sets them apart, if anything, in terms of their thinking and their ideology. We had fatwas with bin Laden. I don't know that ISIS has issued fatwas, but let's start with that, right from the top of these organizations, how they've changed and how their leaders present themselves differently.
Sure, and thanks everybody for having us. So to me, you know, the core difference between the Al-Qaeda of 9/11 and ISIS today is that the original Al-Qaeda was a vanguard movement. They saw themselves as the elites, an intellectual elite and an operational elite whose primary role was to awaken the masses, and that's a very common theme in extremist groups, is you're going to wake up the masses, and then the masses will take things into their own hands. So in Al-Qaeda's view, they're going to awaken the Muslim masses who are all going to rise up against local rulers, corrupt apostate rulers, and against Western influence. And as a vanguard group, the bar to entry was very high, and the amount of time you spent being trained and indoctrinated before you did anything was very high. And ISIS is the culmination of changes, sort of overlapping circles of changes that have happened since September 11th, and it's a populist movement now. It seeks to be a mass movement. It's still very small by the scale of most mass movements, even though it's very large by the scale of jihadist groups. But it's a populist movement, so the barrier to entry is very low, and the amount of time that you spend being indoctrinated before you go into action is very low. And this is a pretty fundamental change, you know, in keeping with that sort of mass movement ideology, and this is something that really happened in stages. We went from being like a terrorist operation to being an insurgent army. And when you have an army, one of the reasons for this shift is when you have an army, you need people. You need a lot of people. And so you need them to come quickly, you need them to mobilize quickly. And so what we've seen with ISIS, and we see this in its Western, I think, recruits in particular, is that they're not very committed. They don't really necessarily, you know, they don't come from a real religious background. A lot of them are people who are inclined to violence to begin with, and that's sort of what makes them appealing to ISIS. Al-Qaeda didn't want axe-wielding maniacs. They wanted people who would be disciplined, who would follow orders. In fact, obedience was in the founding documents of Al-Qaeda. They talk about the recruits they wanted, and they listed obedience 3 different times in a bullet list of 5 points. And you know, they wanted people who were going to be disciplined, follow orders, and not draw attention to themselves until they were ready to act. And ISIS will take what they can get. And we've seen this in theater in Syria and Iraq, but we also see it in their Western recruits. For instance, you know, people who are unbalanced or have a history of violence or history of criminal activity will just suddenly act out and say it's in the name of ISIS. And so, you know, we're really talking about a different kind of, whole different kind of movement, whole different kind of threat.
And the point you just made about how Al-Qaeda was sort of a hard organization to join, you didn't just join on Twitter. And Joshua, some of the defendants that you've seen in court clearly went through that. I mean, they had to be introduced to someone, they had to go to the right place in Peshawar and then be taken to a guest house. ISIS seems to have a different approach.
Yeah, to the sense that it's reflected in the kinds of cases and kinds of defendants to whom whom I've represented or have had discussions with, and witnesses and overseas investigation. The pre-9/11 Al-Qaeda, even pre-embassy bombings Al-Qaeda, is what we refer to as like core Al-Qaeda, which is a very, very strict, and as JM said, a very strict membership organization of not an extraordinary number, and contracted in the sense of as if it was a corporation with all sorts of rules and obligations and benefits at the same time. And and also I think that there was, because of the age, which they generally were older, they generally were educated on a certain level and had spent a lot of time in either the organization or in a mujahideen context, whether going back to Afghanistan or their own countries such as Egypt and Yemen. But what you have is a much more, I think, coherent doctrine of their version of Islam, which, as compared to many young ISIS recruits today whose Islam is really a mile wide and an inch deep. And so in that sense, it was a very coherent part of their philosophy that they could debate with you and discuss with you. You may not agree, but yet it had a coherence to it that was recognizable. Also, I think, and I don't think I ever made it out of AP Physics, but I think that one of the things that always fascinated me was the concept of entropy, which is a thermodynamic concept, but basically is the tendency towards disorder of energy. And I think we've seen that in this context, which is a very hierarchical and rules-oriented organization such as Al-Qaeda, then breaking up, and ironically, one of the great dispersals of energy are explosions. That's what they're about, is the harnessing and then the dispersion of energy. But we've seen that in the organizational context with respect to Al-Qaeda diminishing, but then ISIS arising in this totally diffuse way in which two people don't have to agree on anything to be members or to act on behalf of the organizations. And that makes, again, when you're talking about, speaking to, we've heard from law enforcement people today, and makes the predictability and the recognition of it very difficult. Also makes the difficult, and this is a problem that I face in cases in the context of defense work, which is how to distinguish, and I say this as a matter of charging, overcharging, entrapment, informants, all of that, which is how to distinguish from someone who is merely acting out a certain, and I would say acting out, I mean it in the psychological sense, not in the action sense, but pre any conduct, pre-violence, pre-travel, all of that, but ideating all of this, and are those people who are then engaged in the criminal justice system genuine threats, or are they people who, left alone, wouldn't do anything? It's very hard to tell, and I know that, for law enforcement, it's a very difficult concept, particularly after Boston and San Bernardino, so they always err on the side of, not always, but they predominantly, and these days err for different reasons, but they err on the side of putting them all together, when I think that it's so diffuse now, it makes it very difficult to have a coherent sense of what this, what a doctrine is for an organization.
It seems that both of these groups, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, have similar ideology, at least in terms of their orientation against the United States. We heard a lot about interventionism, pro and con, on the last panel, and there seems to be a link between American intervention overseas, particularly Muslim countries, and the ideology of these two groups, and also that feeds into how they attract the so-called foreign fighters who share their ideology, certainly against the United States. Yeah,
if I
please.
speak to that. And that's true also in the context of original Al-Qaeda coming out of the Afghan jihad against the Soviets, that it was a sort of an idiosyncratic opposition to U.S. policy. It was really about two things. It was about, first, it was about U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, which is a very religious doctrinal opposition. It's not about actual conduct, such as actual, killing Muslims or engaged in war, but just the actual act of U.S. soldiers on Saudi soil was the opposition, as well as some bit of the Iraqi embargo and the Iraqi and the effect on Iraqi civilian population. And that was not as accessible, I think, to average people in the world.
You're speaking of the first Iraq war.
Yeah. I'm speaking of the period between '92 and '99, let's say. Because the embassy bombings, as you know, Phil, because you covered it, there was a defendant who drove within the passenger seat of the truck to the U.S. Embassy in Kenya, who said that his motivating factor for the embassy itself in Nairobi was the fact that it was a military and intelligence hub for activities that were essentially affecting Iraq and Iraqi civilians. And so that was, but like I said, it wasn't as accessible and it wasn't as dominant either in media or in motivating people. But now you don't really have to go very far to find motivational examples in terms of what the U.S. is doing around the world. And so the notion that you're affecting people in Georgia and California and Minnesota and Chicago is not surprising given the fact that we are, as many places as ISIS is recruiting from, we're in the world fighting in those places, killing people. So it's fertile ground.
And Adam, you've written about the appeal of the ideology, especially to Muslims in Europe. We've heard reminders today that there are 38,000 foreign fighters that have joined ISIS. The most come from Tunisia, but thousands have come from Europe, and many have returned, as we've seen in Paris and Brussels. What do you think is the appeal of the ISIS message now to that vulnerable, if you will, population in Europe?
Do you mind if I hop in on an earlier point?
Pick it up
I will
Throw
get to
out
that.
there,
I think first of all, the relationship between Al-Qaeda and Islamic State and Western policy in both cases is fairly direct. Al-Qaeda is to a large extent an outgrowth of the Afghan jihad, in which the United States, for example, played not a small role. The Islamic State is a bastard child of the Iraq War and then subsequently of the disintegration of Syria. Also, events in which the Western power played an important role. I want to talk about that scattering of energy that you referred to earlier. The scattering of energy can also, of course, have an energy in and of itself. And I think if you look back at the writings of Abu Musab al-Suri, who was an important al-Qaeda theorist and a kind of internal dissident within al-Qaeda, we see, in a sense, a prophecy of the transition from al-Qaeda to the kind of leaderless, anonymous jihadism of the Islamic State. Now, the originality of the Islamic State, in a sense, has been its ability to imaginatively link up two crises of citizenship. One is the crisis of citizenship experienced by disenfranchised Sunnis in Iraq and Syria, and the other is the plight of European Muslims, particularly in countries like France and Belgium, although by no means exclusive to them. If you're and I think it's very important to disaggregate and to say, well, which Islamic State are we talking about? Are we talking about the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, where support really is a matter of survival? We're talking about people who, have been facing Shia death squads in post-invasion Iraq, who are facing, a murderous regime in Damascus, who have no recourse. For them, an acceptance of the Islamic State as the lesser of two evils is essentially a matter of survival. For European Muslims, it's quite different. Let's take France. If you are, on the one hand, there's been a certain degree of integration in France in the last several decades. On the other hand, you have a fringe of people who are growing up in housing projects in the banlieue who find that if they apply for a job with the name Mohammed, they have far less of a chance of an interview, who suffer discrimination in policing, various forms of police brutality. What do they have to look forward to in their lives? Unemployment, various forms of ennui, ostracism, and so if they face a choice between the nothingness of their lives and heroism on the battlefield, for many, the choice is rather easily made. And we should also remember that these are the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of France's own colonial subjects, particularly of French Algerians, who are still really not accepted as French, and in fact, they're still referred to as immigrants. We're talking about third and fourth generation French citizens. So they feel like they're second-class citizens.
I want to keep talking about the differences, but I want to bring Hina in now and shift to a little bit about our response here in the United States. And two things come to mind immediately for you to address. One is our own legal authority to retaliate militarily, as we've been doing for 15 years, Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda, and most recently with ISIS in Syria and in other places. What legal authority is that based on, and how is it shifted? And secondly, in terms of what we're doing domestically, I mentioned the mosque litigation earlier, and John Miller talked about earlier today, the Deputy Commissioner for Terrorism here in New York, talked about outreach to the Muslim community, doing that in a different way now. So on those two issues, the legal authority to retaliate militarily and what we're doing at the community level, how have you seen a shift as we've shifted our focus from Al-Qaeda to ISIS?
I'm not sure that I've seen that much of a shift, and I think I'll step back and talk about something which we've looked at for all of the years that I've been working on this set of issues, but that we still struggle with, which is this concept of resilience and how we respond as a resilient society in accordance with our values and our constitution and the principles that we espouse in response to the threat of terrorism and the actuality of terrorism. And part of that resilience, I think, has got to be conceptualizing the actual threat and what it is. And I thought it was very important when Ali Soufan talked during the earlier conversation about the foreign fighter threat and people going to join ISIS abroad, that there are about 150 people from the United States who've done that, as compared to others from Europe and elsewhere. And to my mind, it's very important to keep that in mind. What is the scope of the problem, and what is the scope of our response to that problem? Are we putting in place programs that are counterproductive, the scope that makes things worse? And it may be because we are in this very volatile election year that the ratchet seems to be going only one way. We're not talking about resilience, we're talking about fear and fear-mongering and an existential threat, which I don't think the facts support. So with that as some level of background, let me talk about the legal authority. And the legal authority, I think, is deeply problematic. We are responding in multiple parts of the world engaged in war and war-based or warlike actions under the 2001 authorization for use of military force. And I think that authorization is an absolutely broken tool for domestic authority for going into war in other places. That authorization was very specific. It talked about 9/11 and a connection to 9/11. We've now stretched it, and the Obama administration and Bush administration both have stretched it to claim domestically based legal authority to use lethal force in countries in which and with which we were not at war, and to engage in wars separately. Now, it is no secret to any of us sitting in this room that the system, the separation of powers established under our system for when we go to war vests the authority to declare war in Congress. Congress has for decades failed to exercise that authority, and part of the pattern that we've then seen, which is something that's very hard to pull back from, is expansive executive branch claims of authority in the absence of meaningful congressional oversight and, in fact, potentially congressional assent by continuing to fund these wars. And I say that as a very problematic thing as we think about not just the administrations that have come before and the wars that we have engaged in before, but also the administrations that might come after, regardless of who is president and how you rein in that executive authority. Phil, you've given me the challenge of covering quite a lot, but I'm going to also take a couple of minutes to talk about the domestic,
please.
The domestic aspect. And there I think I go back to resilience again. Take as just one example, the NYPD's program for surveillance of Muslims, which Commissioner Miller pointedly didn't mention, even as he criticized others who might propose something similar. This is something I know a little bit about, having sued the NYPD with respect to this program on behalf of our clients. And this is a program that came from a theory of the intellectual underpinnings of this were a theory of so-called radicalization, which is shared by the FBI, and which essentially posited a very simplistic, unscientific connection between religious belief and engagement in violence, which just simply is not borne out. The social science, admittedly frustratingly, tells you that there's no one profile of how someone is going to go from belief of any kind into violence. And with the absence of the profile, and I understand that that's frustrating, what we've often resorted to in the last decade is the kinds of programs that the NYPD engaged in, which was mapping of American Muslim communities in the tri-state area, sending undercovers and informants into homes, into mosques and businesses, and really engendering a sense of massive distrust by New York Muslims of their own police force and alienation. I think that the current administration, certainly in negotiating a proposed settlement with us, which results in never before kinds of important reforms to NYPD's policing, recognizes the damage that was done. And that's important not just because of what happened here, which was, in our view, a violation of the Equal Protection Clause as well as the religious freedom clauses of the Constitution, but it's important because something of this kind is playing out both nationally and internationally. One thing I hope to touch on, and I'm going to just stop there with a mention of them, is so-called countering violent extremism programs that you should all know about because they are proliferating domestically and internationally. And I think at a conference that talks about hindsight, they threaten to repeat and worsen the mistakes of the past, and that's an important conversation we should have.
Well, why don't we just go with the flow, and I'll just scrap my agenda here. But I know everyone wants to talk about that, so let's just pick up on that point, because we do live in a world where our law enforcement said again today, obviously one attack is one attack too many. We have a posture of prevention and preventive prosecution, so we could talk about how informants, whether they're in the Muslim community or wherever they're found, lead us to defendants or people we're worried about. But there is very much a belief right now that there's a lot of recruitment happening online. A lot of our technology companies, not just Apple, but Twitter and the rest, are under pressure to do something about it, to take down those ISIS accounts. And as part of that, at West Point and other places, our government, led by the State Department, is in this sort of multi-platform effort, right, to counter violent extremism. What's not working with that, Jam? Why is that going to be ineffective?
So, yeah, I've been both a vocal critic and a participant in countering violent extremism discussions over the last several years. I'm going to stitch together responses to several things that have been said over the last 10 minutes, and it's all going to beautifully come together. You're going to be so impressed. And it's going to actually answer the question you just asked. I would take issue with something that Adam said, which is I don't see ISIS as sort of the culmination of al-Suri's vision. I think it's very centralized organization in many ways, and when we see that, this idea of leaderless resistance that al-Suri was pitching, which originated with white supremacists in the United States, is like, it's a beautiful myth that doesn't work very well. And really, social contact is people get into identity-based extremist groups because they crave social contact with a community that shares their identity. And where we see this, and this gets into sort of the proportionate response question that Hina was just talking about, is social media in particular is changing the way that we make communities and changing what it means to know somebody. So you can know somebody who you've never met. You can have contact with them every day. I have colleagues who I see every 2 years, who I talk to online every day, and they're part of my individual life. And as some of you may know, I had a lengthy correspondence with Omar Hamami, an American who was in al-Shabaab that went on for months. And, I felt like there was a real person on the other end of that line, even though I never met him, didn't share his life experience. The issue is, on social media, you can discover people. who share your interests in ways that were never possible before. So the example that I use all the time in talking about this is if you were a radical druid in Peoria in 1950, you would go your whole life, you would never meet anybody who shared your interests. Today, if you're that same person, you get online and you know 100 people in 5 minutes. And the issue that I have, and this gets into the proportionate response sort of realm, is that this is something that all extremist groups are going to benefit from, and we're seeing other extremist groups already start to benefit from them. This isn't just we see things too much through this prism of ISIS. In fact, white nationalists, I have a paper that'll be coming out in the next maybe a month or so that sort of like looks at white nationalists using Twitter. They're doing better than ISIS is right now. They're not getting suspended as often, which is part of why they're doing better, but they are doing better. They're recruiting more, they have more numbers, they're more active. So all this, the discussion about CVE is sort of blossoms out of all these concerns. And in some ways, the idea of CVE is something, it comes from a genuine desire to find routes to deal with this problem other than arresting people or killing people, which is a good impulse. The problem is that almost everything that gets talked about in this space is like based on made up stuff. So theories, whether it's theory of radicalization, I'll be putting my theory of radicalization out in a month or so you guys can go to town on that. It's not specific to jihadists, which is one of the key things that I was really sort of shooting for with it. But there's this impulse that we want to get out there and find some alternative to war, find some alternative to law enforcement in every case. And ultimately, those good intentions are fueled by lack of research and not just lack of research, but ignoring the existing research on what causes violent extremism. So, I have a lot of friends in the State Department. They are very fixated, some of them, on, we're going to fix poverty in Africa and then we won't have a violent extremism problem. It's like, well, first off, poverty and violent extremism don't correlate in a way that makes you think that's going to work. And then secondly, fixing poverty in Africa is a much harder problem than fixing violent extremism. It's a bigger problem with much more deeply entrenched roots. So to my mind, there is a role for CVE. I think that role is to get in the way of recruitment networks. One thing that we can do, that you can do very well, social media lends itself to the kind of data gathering that lets you do this, is you can go online and you can identify recruiters, people who are actually with the organization, with the movement, who are out there actively recruiting and pushing these people. And in most of the cases that we've seen where there's been violence, not all of them, but most of them, there's an ISIS guy on the other end of the line who's a little voice in this person's ear. It was Junaid Hussain for a long time. And, these people who are doing the recruitment job, in order to recruit, you have to leave fingerprints. You have to do it in open source. You don't have to, you don't go to encrypted communications on your iPhone immediately. You just like wake up one day and there's an encrypted message from ISIS. No, you have to meet them on Twitter first. You have to meet them on Facebook first. So disrupting those recruitment networks is the single most important thing you can do to counter violent extremism, because you get into violent extremism, the only really good correlation that we've ever found is that you get into violent extremism because you know people who are violent extremists. And if there's an organized, detectable effort by an illegal organization to do this, we can get in there and we can do some counter messaging. That's fine. That can be part of the mix. But really, the more you can interfere with what the extremists are trying to do, the more you're narrowing the scope to stopping a bad guy activity instead of trying to create citizens who meet your definition of, perfectly pluralistic, happy, well-adjusted, living in the village. I don't know if you ever watched The Prisoner,
So we have this sort of, as John Miller called it, clickbait, promising valor, belonging, and empowerment. And so we're monitoring that, right, as a government, investigators. Then there's also this straight line, which Miller talked about, intel, detection, intervention, and arrest. It's one thing to talk about the networks, but here in the States, we're really focusing on the individuals who might be lured. And it sounds like the intervention piece doesn't happen that much. I know, Josh, you have a case in California where Actually, the father intervened and called the FBI and didn't get the outcome that he wanted. The center here at Fordham has studied the 85 or so cases where we've brought federal prosecutions in the last year and a half, and a large number of them involve this sort of online communication and not really a commitment by a young person, more of a curiosity, maybe talking about buying a plane ticket, that kind of thing. But what have you seen that concerns you in terms of the approach responding to the online world?
Sure. First, I think the term de-radicalization should be shelved entirely. It's not illegal to be radical, and radicals are not necessarily violent. If you want de-radicalization, you should start with the Republican presidential candidates. It's about violent and illegal activity and trying to stem that and trying to stem people's perceptions of how to succeed in the world. Because right now, and I don't think there's any disagreement among the people we've heard before, that really we're talking about people who see no path to success in the world that they inhabit. And so, you know, a word like de-radicalization is the same as using the word crusade in this context. It's just wrong. And it doesn't achieve anything. It sends the wrong message. And I think counter-messaging, by the way, by itself is illusory. The message is counterfeit as long as the policy doesn't support it. So the counter-messaging of somehow the United States as a peaceful country at war around the globe is transparently ludicrous to those who see it, and in fact is a good way to help recruitment to violent organizations because it's so hypocritical that why would you believe anything? It's reefer madness for the terrorism world. So aside from changing policy, I happen to be a proponent of programs, and I will call them diversion programs. And I'll tell you where I come from, why I support it, and why I see it as beneficial. I come from it from the criminal justice system on two fronts. One is I have had 15 years of watching predominantly young people go to jail for 15, 20, 30 years, in many respects because of their belief systems, followed by some conduct in some cases not necessarily followed by conduct. And I'm tired of watching that. I'm tired of that being the only alternative in our system, which is nothing or everything. And by the way, nothing is really not an alternative anymore for a couple of reasons. One of which is some Facebook posts, some Twitter posts, so some tweets, you will be on the radar. And then you run the risk of an informant running at you. The informant's job is not to put you in a situation where you're not going to break the law. It's the opposite. It's the same as the recruiter. So you wind up with people who aren't necessarily criminals being caught up in the criminal justice system. We don't have an alternative. And law enforcement is not the answer to that alternative. I agree 100% with law. That's not their job. It's like previous panelist Olivan was talking about, the Department of War versus the Department of Defense and what the job is. It's not their job because I know that from after Boston, there is a terror among law enforcement that they're going to give somebody a pass who's going to wind up committing a horrific, violent act. So it's not their job. And it can't come from government because the message is unacceptable from government. It just will not be accepted. But again, coming from the criminal justice system, there was a lot of objection. And I go back a long time. I go back 35 years as a criminal defense lawyer. And there still are objections, and they're rational objections to diversion courts, drug courts, mental health courts. Those kind of courts that were designed to take people out of the criminal justice system and address their fundamental problem that put them there and not the illegal conduct that gets them a jail term that solves nothing. These programs have the same possibility, and I envision, as part of these programs, a social service infrastructure. And I wrote about this in 2009, I think. There's a too long article about it. I wrote for the Wayne State Law Journal after a program. And so one of the questions to me was, well, where's this going to come from? It didn't exist for the drug courts either, and it didn't exist for the mental health courts either. It was a response by social services to a need that was created that they knew would be financed and they knew would be staffed. So I'm not as concerned about that because I've seen it generate from the need for it. Another reason why, the flip side of the concept of people going to jail for long periods of time, ruining their lives. Can you imagine? I mean, really, you don't even have to be convicted. If you're acquitted, you're going to get a job, you're going to get an apartment. Seriously, you're a non-person at that point. I have white-collar clients who, the minute they're indicted, their bank calls them and says, "Thank you very much." The brokerage, their brokerage company calls them, "Thank you very much. Take your account." You can't even find a place to put your money. So these issues are, in many respects, related to a lot of other issues we're seeing in the criminal justice system. But in addition to the jail problem is the flip side of it, which is there are communities and there are families that recognize that they have people in trouble, on the edge, who are vulnerable, mostly emotionally, mental health, stage of their life, their prospects, and they can't do anything about it. Where do they go? My client's father went to the FBI. He's in jail. He's in solitary confinement as a 22-year-old for no reason other than what they say, the nature of the case. He was, by the way, he was not in solitary confinement for first 5 months of his custody. And then the case became public and they put him in solitary confinement. The case is probably months to a year away from trial. That's Alice in Wonderland. Verdict first, sentence later. I mean, sentence first, verdict later, excuse me. But part of that is that, I don't want the choice to be between jail, going overseas to be cannon fodder in some misguided military effort on anybody's part. So jail, dead, permanent exile. I have clients who want to come back. What are they supposed to do? Where do they go? What's the option? So we need to create that in some way. And also, by the way, I also think it's a win-win for law enforcement resources. Instead of throwing informants at people, send them to places that can really help them. Instead of having to worry about every person that you don't know about, you will have communities and families bringing them to these programs for purposes of helping them. And I understand, and I part ways with some people I know who, like me, are civil libertarians to the core. But I don't see it as in the way that I envision, I don't see it as a spying program. It's obviously got to be done in conjunction with government, so it's not a spying program. So governments don't have access to the information in there, the counseling, the people. So it's not just a place where you can gather information then to prosecute people. So I do have a vision of it, and it's highly integrated. And I just think that, we've had 15 years of war and 15 years of killing and 15 years of rolling back. Everybody talks about balance. I don't see balance. I see protecting that tiny kernel of freedom and privacy that remains. We've had 15 years of that, and we're having a conference about how it's worse now than it was 15 years ago. So think about changing the fundamental policy that underlies the approach.
Hina, you wanted to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I am very sympathetic to my friend Josh's concerns in the cases that he has represented people on, and I wish, Josh, that you might be in charge of these kinds of programs that don't yet exist. But given that you're not, I want to talk a little bit about the programs that do exist and where we are, again, sort of looking back and then thinking about looking forward. And one of the things that we're at now is this entrenched notion of prevention, which is very appealing. Don't we? We all want to prevent violence. We all want to prevent terrorism. We all want to prevent wrong. The issue becomes the further that you get away from actual wrongful conduct into we're guessing they might do something wrong, but we don't know, the more issues arise, right? Because we don't. We all admit this, and maybe JM's book is going to answer all my questions about what this profile is. I look forward to reading it. But we all know that there's actually no profile. There's no scientific basis. So the further you get away from it, the more it looks like, and I don't mean to exaggerate, the more it looks like religious and racial profiling and thought policing. Let me give you an example. Back in January of this year, the FBI issued a guidance document or manual called Preventing Violent Extremism in Schools. it posits schools as a budding hotbed of terrorists.
You mean high schools, not colleges?
High schools, high schools. It asks schools to monitor their students for signs of extremist belief and extremist ideology and report that to law enforcement. It posits this notion, and perhaps in response to the critiques we and others have made about how stigmatizing all of these programs are by looking at Muslims through the lens of a security threat alone, creating it second-class citizenship as opposed to regular citizenship. It says that extremists can come in all forms: eco-terrorists, animal rights activists, white militias, and schools should be monitoring their kids and reporting to law enforcement. Now, without any kind of actual profile and indicia, the kinds of indicia that we've seen coming from, for example, the National Counterterrorism Center, a document leaked to a media organization, asks law enforcement, parents, and others to look for signs of alienation, criticism, how connected people are to their communities or to their parents. And I don't know about you, I was once a teenager. I could fit many of these profiles in terms of alienation and so on. And probably, yeah. Josh knows me well. Imagine this document, and you don't have to imagine it's doing it, landing on the desks of high school principals, telling them to monitor their kids and report to law enforcement. How are you going to respond? How proportionate a response is this? And is this an effective or counterproductive tool? Is this something that is likely to make a problem where there is hopefully none? And is it likely to make things worse? Now that's just one example. There are countering violent extremism programs proliferating domestically and abroad. There's no real single agreed upon definition of what these programs are, domestically and in various different pilot cities in which they've been carried out. Famously, we all know, terrorism is a terribly contested term, right? For obvious reasons that I'm not going to get into now in terms of belief and linkage to violence. Violent extremism is just as nebulous and broad, if not more, and it's moving away from that core bad thing that we want to regulate, which is crime and bad action, into belief. And that is deeply concerning, not just at the domestic level, but with our backing and at our behest, the UN just announced a general plan of action for violent extremism programs globally. The UN Secretary General announced that violent extremism is the scourge of our time, but then says there's no single definition of this scourge. Nations are being asked to implement domestic violent extremism programs. And the way it's described, it's discussed interchangeably with extremism, violent extremism, and terrorism, all deeply contested and problematic concepts. And one of the things that I deeply worry about, again, looking at what we've done and lessons learned, is that countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kenya, Nigeria, Uzbekistan are seeing this as an invitation to implement programs targeting people who dissent, who oppose government repression, labeling human rights defenders as violent extremism, and in the long term, when you start out from something that seems very reasonable, which is to prevent bad things from happening, you're implementing these kinds of programs that are not well thought through and are likely to repeat the mistakes of the past.
Can I just?
Go ahead, Jim.
I mean, I think, in the context of what both of you have been talking about, I mean, what I'm arguing for is that really, the problem with CVE is that nobody can tell you whether they're fighting the V or the E. So, and ultimately, the only reason for these programs to exist is to stop violence. The vast majority of these cases, so terrorist violence is already a huge outlier problem. It's a fractional problem in society. But because individual persons will try to kill dozens or hundreds of people at a time, there's some justifiable reason to look at it slightly differently. Ultimately, in this outlier group, it is an extreme outlier for somebody to act without having contact with the organization. So we know, there's debate over what a violent extremist is, but we know what ISIS is. And we can see when people make contact with ISIS. And so, to me, the only function for CVE is, we're talking about de-radicalization. I'm also a very big detractor of that term. I mean, I think there's a role for it in society, but it's not a role for a government program, and it's not a role for a countering violent extremism discussion. I think that what you want is to disengage people with the violent extremist group. So you want to disengage them from ISIS. So when you see them, whatever form this takes, and it's not necessarily, not all of this is necessarily a governmental role. But when you see somebody who's making contact with ISIS, I mean, and I'm fine, let's throw a little bit of messaging at them, but the messaging should be about disengagement. The messaging should be, if somebody, puts in a Google search for ISIS, send them a news story about the fact that ISIS killed 50 of its own fighters. That's fine. Ultimately, what you want is for people to disengage from the organization, because if they're disengaged from the organization, the risk that they're going to commit violence is much, much lower. As a society, we seem to be tolerating mass shootings. We seem to have developed some resilience about that. Ultimately, if you take the organizational piece out of this, it becomes a problem like mass shootings, where we don't bring the entire resources of the U.S. government to bear on it in the same way.
I'm not sure about the implicit analogy being made, though, between ISIS, which admittedly is violent and extreme, and other forms of extremism, like you mentioned, white supremacy, for example. I mean, the focus on the recruiters reminds me, in a sense, of the drug war. That if you just cut out the drug dealer, if you will somehow solve a problem which has much deeper roots. I mean, where
what was even less effective than that was just say no.
Well, right, sure, but where is a let's say a teenage French person, to take one example, most likely to meet a recruiter for Islamic State? It's in a prison where about between 50 and 70% of the inmates are Muslims. So it seems to me you're shifting from the roots of this problem to what are essentially symptoms. Olivier Waugh, I think, argues pretty persuasively that what we're seeing in France and Belgium is not so much radicalized Islamic faith, so much as the Islamization of radicalism. And he points furthermore to the fact that about 25 to 40% of the French people who have gone to fight in Iraq and Syria are converts. They're people who suffer from other forms of exclusion, who have signed on to Islamic State ideology because they feel cut out of the power game in France. So I wonder if this focus on recruitment and belief is in a way misguided and takes us away from broader problems of social exclusion, at least in the West. I'm not talking about the Islamic State dynamic in the region, where I think you're looking at things like state failure, the effects of preemptive war in Iraq, the breakdown in Syria. I mean, another issue that we haven't even gotten to, really, and I think to some extent was overlooked in the previous panel, was the long-term effects of American involvement in the Middle East. It's not as if we are a neutral power simply trying to help the region along in the road towards democracy and peace. I mean, what we're seeing in the region today is, to some extent, the long-term legacy of our relationships to Saudi Arabia, which is the principal promoter of Wahhabist doctrine, and to Israel, which, for decades now has been an occupying power.
Let me throw this out and let you all continue. Ali Soufan earlier said the ideology of Al-Qaeda and ISIS is poisonous fruit from the same evil tree. But when 9/11 happened, all of the reporting talked about hundreds of Al-Qaeda soldiers in Afghanistan or wherever they were. We're in the tens of thousands now with ISIS. Is that because we're militarily involved? When you say the Middle East, if you're on the Pentagon press list, you've gotten emails lately about attacks that the U.S. military has carried out, not just in Iraq, but Syria, Libya, Somalia, Yemen. Some of these are drones. We could talk about the legal concerns there. Have nothing to do with AUMF unless you stretch it. But why are by the thousands? The question used to be, why do they hate us? And why do they like ISIS? Is it the fact that it's the territory, that it's a caliphate, that they're governing? These seem to be some differences. Is that Josh and JM and over here? Weigh in on that, please.
I think one of the things is nothing succeeds like success, which is that Al-Qaeda's two biggest recruiting events were embassy bombings and 9/11. Embassy bombings somewhat changed the nature of the organization. It became, instead of a cadre of mujahideen veterans from Afghanistan, into a sort of a fresh air fund for jihadists to go to Afghanistan and train and then go back to wherever they were, either do nothing or get involved in a local Islamist organization. But 9/11 really changed it from an organization to an ideology. And so it's kind of like Citizen Kane. I mean, where do you go from there? It's like, it was so spectacular in terms of the success. I think it spelled the end of Al-Qaeda in many respects, because it lost the control that its founders wanted in terms of the direction of particular elements of global jihad in one respect. And so this is, to me, I talk about entropy, to me that's a natural outgrowth of it. And the second part of your question was?
Well, it's sort of the overall question of why are the numbers so much higher and the ideology is the same? Is it the attraction to live in this land that they've declared, or something else?
It's somewhat, but it's also it's also what we're doing. The whole panel's not. I mean, the whole day can't just be about them. It's got to be about us, in terms of what are we going to change in terms of our policy to deny habitat, psychic, territorial. Whatever. I mean, also, I don't understand how ISIS keeps going. With 38,000 fighters, they have so much territory. Where do they get their weapons? Where do they get the money? I mean, seriously, there's more to this than simple, gang activity. And so it's. I think that we're ignoring our role, not so much in terms of taking blame, because that's past, but in terms of, unless we change that, the future is the same or worse. So. If and there's a certain, the caliphate is an attraction on a certain level. I see not so far in terms of the age of the people and their feelings of their place in the world. Is 60s people went to communes, they followed the Grateful Dead. Some went to the Spahn Ranch with the Manson family. So we have a much larger Spahn Ranch at this point. But you have people who are disaffected, disenfranchised, and they're looking for a place to belong. That's a very attractive place.
So, I mean, I agree with a lot of policy critiques that I'm hearing today and now, but my thinking on this has always been that we should do the right thing because it's the right thing and not because we think it's going to stop violent extremism. It's very difficult to correlate all of these things to violent extremist activity. I think that probably it would help if we cleaned up our policy portfolio, but I don't think it's a magic solution either. I think that ISIS has the numbers it has. First off, you have to put the invasion of Iraq in 2003 created the space in which ISIS was able to arise. So, I mean, and that was a huge boost to this movement. But I think, the interconnectedness, what we're seeing is that people who have fringe beliefs can find each other more, they can organize, and they can amplify their activities more than they ever were able to do before. And ISIS is only the first iteration of this. And I'm sorry because this is a downer, but it's only the first. We're going to see this with other extremist groups are already starting to emulate some of their tactics online. We see that people are increasingly aware, especially within the United States, that if you can take an action that racks up a body count, then you are going to get a lot of attention onto the cause that you're talking about. And so, I think what we see with ISIS, and one reason in part for its success and also for its lack of success in some respects, is that it has a very apocalyptic ideology. Ali Soufan was talking earlier about the black flags and the apocalyptism of Al-Qaeda. ISIS is 10 times, 100 times as apocalyptic as Al-Qaeda. And those kinds of groups in history, what we've seen is that those beliefs can be very contagious, and they can seize a population and cause like a large population to start behaving in ways that are really very irrational. But they were limited by geography, and they were limited by communications technology. So, the Anabaptists couldn't talk to somebody in, Italy. They couldn't talk to somebody in China. And now, when these ideas get out there, they not only can they spread, but you can use both mass media and social media to reach. You were talking about a belief system that appeals to 0.001% of the population, but if you can reach 80% of the population of hundreds of millions or billions of people, then you can come up with 40,000 people, and 40,000 people is enough to create a lot of chaos.
Well, look what 2 people did in San Bernardino, California, right? It's almost...
For a half hour.
But you understand why the government wants to monitor all of this and the electronic surveillance and why they're doing it, civil liberties concerns aside. You understand the obsession with stopping the homegrown threat and finding the vulnerable people here to commit acts. But the approach obviously still has concerns.
Yeah, I tend not to ever put civil liberties aside. It's a job requirement as well as a personal. But
I just meant the spying part. On the other hand, it's sort of needles in haystacks. With these thousands of messages, and you're trying to find the one person in America or 2 people who might be planning something truly violent.
Well, again, I go back to the issue of resilience and proportionality, right? It's not like there aren't tools that are being used in legitimate ways to do legitimate things. The question is, how far do you take them? So let's just step back a little bit. I am no expert in, the causes of ISIS, although I'm a human being who does her reading, and so I have my own views, but I'm not going to inflict them on you. What I will say is that responsible policy making, it seems to me, would require congressional hearings about what we are actually doing in Iraq and Syria, what our goals are, what success might look like, what temporal geographic limitations there might be to the use of lethal force or other strikes. These are, to the detriment of our democracy, our goals, and our civil liberties, not happening. It's a real problem that that's not happening. And yes, part of the problem is with our politicians and the political debate, but also part of the problem is with us. We should be pushing more to say our long-term security and rights interests are at stake, and when we go to war as a country, it cannot be with blinders on. So that's one part of it. The other part, and related to that, is the proportionality response. We heard on an earlier panel about how the Assad regime is causing more damage, more harm, has resulted in more killings than ISIS has. We can't be blind to what the rest of the world knows and the impact of those policies on the rest of the world, and we've got to look at these issues from the perspective of both legitimacy as well as making sure that what we do is legal and lawful. But moving away from that in sort of AUMF international aspect of it, and going back to your question, Phil, about social media monitoring. So right now, as you all know, and earlier on, we talked a little bit about NSA surveillance earlier on in the day, so I'm going to put that aside for now and talk a little bit more about social media monitoring, which JM also turned on. So there's a significant debate and a significant issue because part of this countering violent extremism initiative that the Obama administration is pushing is online monitoring by Twitter, Facebook, and other companies, right, and scrubbing of content. And again, that's something that sounds very appealing. And in fact, these companies already monitor and take down content that incites actual violence, or that is, advocating actual wrongdoing and terrorism. They do that. I think the concern is what does it look like when corporations engage in taking down content that might be terrorism related, right? One concern is how do they go about doing that practically? I believe it's, don't quote me, get my numbers wrong, but there are 500 million tweets that are taking place every hour, every day. How practically does one do that? Second is, when people in government themselves have issues with figuring out what is actual terrorism versus what might be someone talking about terrorism versus Ahmed the kid who brought a clock to school, who in social media companies has the expertise and why should they be trusted? I will say very importantly that, just to be very clear, the First Amendment and the restrictions on First Amendment monitoring apply to the government, not to corporations, right? So corporations have a perfect right to be able to monitor content and to take it down. But I think the First Amendment reflects not just bars, but also values, right? And it reflects values that we all try and take into account. So in addition to the practical issue, in addition to subject matter expertise concerns, there's some real value in having speech that we disagree with out there and exposed so it can be responded to. And when it's taken down, when corporations take it down, and when they decide what they're going to take down, that can sometimes result in manipulation. It can result in overt censorship, and I'm not talking about government censorship, but takedown of private content, and it can limit what we think about in the First Amendment context as the marketplace of ideas that allow, for example, kids, young people, who are the ones we're now saying are most susceptible to recruitment, from engaging in this kind of debate. And that's not just a theoretical concern. In the UK, for example, which is what we have modeled many of our countering violent extremism programs, kids are being monitored for online speech. Kids are also being required school teachers are required to report to law enforcement about what happens with kids and extremist belief and what they're looking for online and other kinds of things. And as a result, just last month, I believe, the National Union of Teachers came out against the UK government's version of its Countering Violent Extremism program, saying that it was suppressing healthy debate about current affairs, and that lacks pedagogical values. That's not just specific to the UK. In a lot of my work here in New York and elsewhere, one of the things that I find most heartbreaking is American Muslim kids who say, my counterparts can critique US wars, they can critique drone strikes, they can critique foreign policy, but I worry that I am going to be suspected as an extremist by the government if I have Facebook posts and Twitter posts doing the very same things. And that's not the kind of world we espouse to be. I recognize we're having a hard conversation about how to monitor, but the direction in which we are going is not a direction I think we should be happy about.
By the way, has YouTube taken down Anwar al-Awlaki's videos? If you know.
I believe that most of them are still up,
still there.
because a lot of them are not about actual wrongdoing. But yes, they are up.
I want to turn it over to questions in just a minute.
I'll just see you and raise you on this because I think I've tried to get reporters interested in this question, and none of them are, but maybe the ACLU would be interested. Social media companies suspend thousands and thousands of people every day for a wide variety of reasons and disclose nothing about what they're doing. So even beyond the question that we're talking about with violent extremism and the overlapping question with free speech, the fact is we know nothing about what they are doing in terms of suspensions. So to give you for an example, if you were able to open the books at Facebook or Twitter and look at who gets suspended for threatening violence to people, what would you find? Would you find that, people of a certain color are suspended much more often than people of another color for making the same basic threat? Would you find that threats against men get suspended more than threats against women? Would you find, yeah, I mean, you know, there's just an unbelievable world of stuff going on that we never see anything about. And, you know, I keep trying to tell people this is like the next big story in social media, and I don't know why nobody gets excited about it except me.
I'll follow up with you. Let me get Adam here to say one more comment, and get your questions ready. Remember, questions, not speeches. We've talked a lot about the legal clarity here of investigation and retaliation. I know you've written about the moral clarity and another way of looking at our response to these threats, real and perceived. Say anything you want.
I'm not sure what the question is, but
well, in terms of it's not just a legal question; it's a moral question as well as a foreign policy question.
Right, I mean, I think
in terms of how we respond to this threat.
Right.
real
I
and
mean, I think
perceived.
ultimately the solutions are longer-term political solutions. In the Middle East, there needs to be a settlement in Iraq and Syria that provides a horizon to, for the most part, to Sunnis who feel that they have been locked out. So that's essential there. I mean, and there are of course many other problems. For example, in Egypt today, we have gone from a democratic uprising to the rise of a Muslim Brotherhood-led government to a military coup, and now the formation of one of the most dictatorial regimes in the Middle East. Do you hear much criticism in the United States of that regime? The Muslim Brotherhood, for all of its flaws and authoritarianism, was not a jihadi organization. The effect of that coup has been to drive a lot of people towards groups like Islamic State. Similarly, in the West, there has to be some form of inclusion, essentially full citizenship in countries such as France, the country that I know best. I mean, if we go back to, let's say, the early 1980s, the mid-1980s, the sort of quote-unquote heroic years of the Afghan jihad, were there many young French citizens who were going to Afghanistan to fight with Osama bin Laden? No, there weren't, because there was a horizon. There was the anti-racist organization SOS Racisme, which organized a large march, the March of the Berger. There was a very active Communist Party that channeled discontent in the banlieue into more productive forms. The Socialist Party was also very active in the banlieue. Today, the Socialist Party, under the leadership of François Hollande and his Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, who is, I think, an example of a fundamentalist secularist, has responded to the attacks by imposing a state of emergency. Who's going to bear the brunt of that state of emergency? French Muslims. So ultimately, the long-term solutions to this problem are political, in my view. I mean, I'm not saying that there can't be some role for military intervention at certain points, but on the whole, the response has to be social and political.
Thank you all on the panel, audience for staying. Karen, did you want to say something?
Yeah. I just want to say, I was hoping for sort of a one-line takeaway, 15 years hindsight, and we're all living in peaceful, happy circumstances. The one thing that we can take away is that for 15 years, we've found a safe space to talk about these things, and they're not easy. And so I thank you all for your patience, your tolerance, and your openness. Have a good day.